In the mid-14th century, a shadow loomed over Europe. The Black Death swept through cities, claiming lives with terrifying speed. Streets once filled with laughter now echoed with silence, as families were torn apart by an unseen enemy. As the plague spread, panic gripped the hearts of the populace. People fell ill without warning, and the familiar rhythms of life shattered. The air thickened with fear, leaving communities desperate for answers that eluded them. With no clear cause for the devastation, whispers of blame began to circulate. Neighbors turned suspicious of one another, as the search for a scapegoat intensified. In the absence of understanding, fear took root. Amid the chaos, the absence of explanations led to a dangerous narrative. The sick were often seen as harbingers of doom, and the idea that someone must be responsible began to take hold in the minds of the desperate. As death tolls rose, the fabric of society began to fray. Trust eroded, and the bonds that held communities together weakened. Fear transformed neighbors into potential enemies, each person a suspect in a deadly game. In this atmosphere of dread, the search for meaning became a collective obsession. People began to interpret the plague as divine punishment, a sign that their society had strayed from the path of righteousness. As the days turned into weeks, the death toll mounted, and the incomprehensible nature of the plague deepened despair. With no answers, the urge to find someone to blame grew stronger, pushing communities to the brink. The relentless advance of the Black Death left a profound mark on the psyche of Europe. As fear overwhelmed reason, the question remained, why did societies turn on their own, seeking to punish rather than confront the true enemy? In a world where understanding slipped through their fingers, the search for a scapegoat became an urgent necessity. What drove ordinary people to such extremes? The answer lay just beyond the horizon, waiting to be uncovered. In the absence of understanding, medieval society turned to ancient beliefs. Theories of divine punishment and astrology flourished as people sought answers in the stars and scriptures. A world once grounded in reason now teetered on the edge of superstition. As the plague swept through towns, traditional healers found themselves powerless. Remedies of herbs and bloodletting failed to stem the tide of death. Desperation grew as families watched their loved ones succumb to a relentless illness. Fear of the unknown twisted minds into believing in conspiracies. Whispers of poisoned air and malevolent forces took root. Neighbors began to suspect one another as the plague's invisible hand sowed distrust among communities. Religious leaders struggled to maintain faith as their prayers went unanswered. The church, once a bastion of hope, found its authority challenged. People began to question if their sins had drawn divine wrath upon them. Astrology and folklore became the new guides for the frightened populace. Charts and predictions replaced medical knowledge as people sought to decode the chaos surrounding them. Superstitions flourished in the void of reason. With each passing day, the death toll rose, and the search for answers intensified. Families turned to folklore, believing that only through rituals could they appease the unseen forces they feared. The line between faith and madness blurred. As illness spread, so did the fear of outsiders. Townspeople began to associate the plague with those who were different. Marginalized groups became scapegoats, as the desperate sought someone to blame for their suffering. In this atmosphere of dread, the failure of medicine and faith left a void filled with paranoia. Rumors spread like wildfire, each tale more fantastical than the last, as people clung to any explanation that made sense of their suffering. As the plague ravaged communities, the search for meaning grew more desperate. With no clear answers, the human instinct to find a culprit intensified, setting the stage for the violence that would soon erupt among neighbors. As the plague ravaged towns, whispers of divine wrath filled the air. People sought meaning in their suffering, believing that sin must be punished. In this atmosphere of dread, the search for scapegoats began. Rumors spread like wildfire, claiming that hidden heretics were to blame for the plague. In darkened homes, families gathered to discuss their suspicions, their voices hushed and filled with paranoia as fear twisted their grief into accusations. The search for answers intensified, leading to public gatherings where townspeople debated the causes of their suffering. As they sought clarity, their grief morphed into a desperate need to find someone to blame. turning neighbors into adversaries. In the midst of this turmoil, a young man named Thomas, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, emerged as a vocal critic of the town's leaders. He questioned their authority, urging the people to look beyond their fears and seek rational explanations. Yet as Thomas spoke out, the tide of suspicion grew. His words, meant to unite, only fueled the flames of division. The community, desperate for a target, began to see him as a threat, further entrenching their fears. The idea of collective guilt took hold, as neighbors began to scrutinize one another. Accusations of heresy and treachery spread, turning friendships into rivalries. Trust eroded, leaving only fear and suspicion in its wake. As the plague continued to claim lives, the people's need for a tangible enemy grew. They became convinced that only through the eradication of perceived threats could they hope to appease divine anger and restore order. The relentless search for blame led to a chilling atmosphere in the town. Families began to turn against one another, as fear transformed grief into a dangerous quest for justice, however misguided it might be. With each passing day, the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. The plague's grip tightened, and as fear drove the community deeper into suspicion, the search for a scapegoat became an inescapable part of their reality. As the Black Death ravaged Europe, fear turned into a search for scapegoats. Marginalized groups, particularly Jews, faced accusations of poisoning wells, their long-standing status as outsiders fueling the flames of panic. In the chaos, lepers and foreigners were also targeted. Their visible differences became evidence of guilt, as fear twisted reason and transformed neighbors into accusers, ready to condemn those who appeared other. Rumors spread like wildfire, igniting old prejudices. The idea that outsiders were responsible for the plague took root, as communities sought to blame their misfortunes on those they had long viewed with suspicion. Accusations were often baseless, yet they gained traction. The fear of the plague became a catalyst for violence, as neighbors turned against neighbors, driven by a desperate need to find someone to blame. In this atmosphere of paranoia, the local clergy often fueled the fire, preaching that the plague was divine retribution. Their sermons reinforced the notion that certain groups were to blame, deepening the divide. As accusations intensified, the boundaries of community began to blur. Those once seen as neighbors became potential threats, and the very fabric of society began to unravel under the weight of fear. With each new accusation, the cycle of violence escalated. The marginalized were not only blamed but became targets for retribution, as fear transformed into a misguided sense of justice among the populace. In this dark chapter, the distinction between truth and falsehood became increasingly irrelevant. The need for a scapegoat overshadowed the reality of the disease, as fear dictated actions over reason. As the pogroms began to unfold, the consequences of these accusations would ripple through communities. The question remained, how far would fear drive humanity to protect itself from an unseen enemy? As the Black Death ravaged towns, whispers of betrayal turned into shouts of accusation. In the streets of Strasbourg, a crowd gathered, fueled by fear and suspicion, seeking someone to blame for their suffering. Neighbors who once shared meals now eyed each other with distrust. The air was thick with tension, as families turned against those they had known for years, convinced that their very survival depended on purging the perceived threat. In the midst of this turmoil, a young woman named Elise, with dark hair pulled tightly back and piercing blue eyes, found herself at the center of a mob's fury, accused of witchcraft and betrayal. The violence escalated rapidly. In towns across Europe, pogroms erupted, with mobs justifying their brutality as a necessary purification. The cries for justice drowned out the voices of reason. In the heat of the moment, the line between justice and vengeance blurred. Those who once offered comfort now wielded weapons, believing that violence was the only way to cleanse their communities of the plague. Rulers and clergy, once seen as protectors, often turned a blind eye or even encouraged the violence. In this chaotic landscape, authority crumbled, leaving fear to dictate the actions of the masses. As the pogroms spread, the sense of community disintegrated. Neighbors became executioners, driven by the belief that their actions were a form of self-defense against an unseen enemy lurking within. Elise, now in hiding, witnessed the transformation of her world. The streets she once roamed freely were now filled with the echoes of violence, and the bonds of trust lay shattered beneath the weight of panic. The violence, framed as a necessary evil, left scars that would linger long after the last torch was extinguished. With fear reigning supreme, the question remained, who would be next to suffer in this cycle of blame? In towns across Europe, fear permeated the air, and local rulers found themselves paralyzed. As the plague ravaged communities, their authority diminished, leaving a vacuum filled by chaos and mob mentality. Law enforcement faltered, and cries for justice turned into shouts for blood. Clergy, once seen as moral guides, now faced a crisis of faith. Some chose to protect the vulnerable, while others fueled the flames of violence. In this turmoil, the church's role shifted from sanctuary to accomplice as fear dictated their actions. As accusations flew, the justice system became reactive rather than proactive. Local councils, overwhelmed by fear, began to sanction violence, believing it would restore order. The very fabric of society unraveled as law gave way to mob consensus. In this atmosphere of dread, neighbors turned against neighbors. The bonds of community frayed as individuals sought safety in numbers, often at the expense of those deemed different. The law was no longer a shield but a weapon wielded by the fearful. The cries for justice morphed into a frenzy of violence. The streets became battlegrounds, where the innocent were swept away in a tide of hysteria. What had once been a community now resembled a war zone, driven by paranoia and anger. Amid the chaos, some individuals emerged as unlikely protectors. A few brave souls risked their lives to shield the accused from the mob, driven by a sense of humanity that defied the overwhelming fear that consumed their neighbors. As the violence escalated, the once clear lines between right and wrong blurred. The moral compass of society faltered, and survival instincts took precedence over compassion. Fear became the guiding principle, drowning out the voices of reason. With each act of violence, the authority that had once governed the towns eroded further. The law, now a mere echo of its former self, was reshaped by the collective fear of the populace, leaving justice in disarray. As the chaos continued, the question lingered: who would restore order in a world where fear had become the law? The fragile remnants of authority struggled to regain control, but the tide of panic surged ever higher. In the shadow of the plague, fear transformed communities into battlegrounds of suspicion. Neighbors once bound by trust now eyed each other with trepidation, as whispers of betrayal echoed through the streets. The bonds of kinship frayed, replaced by a primal instinct to survive at any cost. As the plague ravaged the population, moral lines blurred. Acts of kindness became rare, replaced by a desperate need to distance oneself from perceived threats. The once vibrant marketplace now lay empty, echoing with the silence of lost trust, where merchants avoided eye contact and shared glances of fear. Families turned against one another, driven by the fear of contagion. A mother, once nurturing, now hesitated to embrace her own child, the innocence of love overshadowed by the dread of illness. In this new reality, survival trumped affection, and compassion faded into the shadows. Communities fractured further as accusations flew like arrows. Neighbors who had shared meals now pointed fingers, seeking scapegoats among those who were different. The fear of the unknown fueled a frenzy that justified violence, as compassion was sacrificed on the altar of survival. In the absence of leadership, the moral compass of society crumbled. Local authorities, once protectors, became enablers of violence. They turned a blind eye to the mob's actions, prioritizing their safety over justice, as fear dictated the new order of the day. As the violence escalated, the sense of community vanished. The very fabric of society unraveled, leaving behind a landscape marked by bloodshed and betrayal. Trust, once a cornerstone of daily life, was now a relic of a bygone era, overshadowed by the specter of fear. The relentless grip of fear transformed even the most virtuous into the unthinkable. Neighbors became executioners, justifying their actions as necessary for survival. The plague claimed lives, but fear devoured the humanity that once bound them together. Amidst the chaos, the echoes of laughter and joy faded into memory. Children, once symbols of hope, now wandered the streets, their eyes hollow, reflecting the loss of innocence. The world they knew had been replaced by a harsh reality, where survival trumped all. As the plague continued its relentless march, the moral collapse deepened. Each day brought new horrors, and the question of what it meant to be human lingered in the air. With trust shattered, the future loomed uncertain, leaving communities teetering on the brink. As the last remnants of the plague fade, towns lie eerily quiet. The streets, once bustling with life, now echo with the absence of familiar voices. Survivors emerge from their homes, haunted by memories of those lost and the violence they witnessed. Guilt weighs heavily on their souls as they grapple with the actions taken in fear. In this silence, the question lingers: how do they rebuild a shattered community? In the aftermath, the scars of violence remain etched in the minds of those who lived through the pogroms. Families are fractured and friendships severed. The villagers, once united against a common fear, now avoid eye contact, haunted by the knowledge of betrayal. They walk past empty homes where once vibrant lives were extinguished, each step a reminder of the darkness that lurked within their hearts. Amidst the ruins, a young woman named Elin, in her late 20s with dark hair and a weathered face, stands before a makeshift memorial. It is adorned with flowers and small tokens left by those mourning the loss of loved ones. Ellen's hands tremble as she places a candle among the offerings, a flickering flame symbolizing the hope that one day forgiveness might replace the bitterness that lingers. As weeks turn into months, the silence of the village is occasionally broken by whispers of the past. Survivors recount tales of the violence, but the names of the accused are seldom spoken. Guilt hangs in the air, and the once vibrant community now feels like a ghost town, where laughter has been replaced by hushed conversations and a shared understanding of the horrors that transpired. Elin, burdened by her own memories, seeks solace in the forest beyond the village. She wanders through the trees, where the air is thick with the scent of damp earth. Here, nature remains untouched by the violence, offering her a brief respite from the weight of her guilt. Yet even in this sanctuary, the shadows of the past follow her, reminding her that healing will take time. The once vibrant marketplace, now a mere shadow of its former self, stands as a testament to what was lost. Vendors have vanished, and the stalls are empty, save for a few remnants of goods left behind. Survivors occasionally gather, exchanging wary glances, their conversations laced with unspoken fears and regrets. The marketplace, once a place of community, now feels like a reminder of betrayal. As the seasons change, the village begins to heal, though the wounds run deep. Some survivors attempt to rebuild, planting seeds in the hope of new beginnings. Yet the memories of violence linger like a shadow, casting doubt on their efforts. Each sprout that breaks through the soil is a reminder that while life continues, the past cannot be easily forgotten. Ellen returns to the village, her heart heavy with the knowledge that some wounds may never heal. She sees familiar faces, but they are marked by the shared trauma of the past. The air is thick with unspoken words, and the silence that once felt comforting now feels oppressive. The community must confront its past if it hopes to find a way forward, but the path remains uncertain. In the quiet moments, Elin reflects on her choices and the choices of others. The village, though battered, holds the potential for reconciliation. Yet, as the memories of violence fade into the background, the question remains: can they forgive themselves and each other? The journey toward healing is just beginning, and the weight of the past continues to shape their future. In the centuries following the Black Death, the echoes of fear and violence reverberated through Europe. Communities that once thrived became shadows of their former selves, haunted by memories of betrayal and bloodshed. The scars left by the pogroms were not merely physical. They altered the very fabric of society, fostering a climate of suspicion that would resurface in future crises. The past lingered, a ghostly reminder of humanity's darker impulses. The legacy of the pogroms manifested in subsequent waves of scapegoating throughout history. During times of uncertainty, marginalized groups often became convenient targets. The witch hunts of the late 16th century and the persecution of Jews during the Spanish Inquisition echo the same fears that fueled the violence of the Black Death. Each episode reveals a society grappling with its own demons, seeking out enemies in the absence of understanding. As the centuries unfolded, the cycle of panic continued. The French Revolution saw the rise of paranoia against perceived enemies of the state, leading to the Reign of Terror. Fear of the unknown fueled extreme measures, as neighbors turned against neighbors once more. History teaches that in times of crisis, reason often yields to hysteria, and the quest for justice can become a justification for violence. The 20th century brought its own waves of fear, from the Red Scare in America to the Holocaust in Europe. Each instance of mass hysteria followed a familiar pattern. Uncertainty breeds suspicion, and scapegoats are found among those deemed different. The atrocities committed during these periods remind us that the legacy of the Black Death pogroms is not just historical. It is a cautionary tale that resonates through time. In modern times, the echoes of past fears reverberate in the face of new crises. Global pandemics, economic downturns, and social unrest often provoke a resurgence of scapegoating. The rhetoric of blame can quickly spiral, as seen in recent events where marginalized communities are unjustly targeted. The legacy of the Black Death serves as a stark reminder that fear can distort our humanity. Survivors of the Black Death pogroms carried their trauma into future generations. The stories of those who suffered became intertwined with the collective memory of their communities. Oral histories passed down through families served as both a warning and a reminder of the fragility of trust. The legacy of fear is often inherited, shaping perceptions and behaviors long after the original events have faded. As we reflect on this legacy, it becomes clear that the cycle of fear and scapegoating is not confined to the past. Each generation faces the challenge of recognizing and confronting these impulses. Education and empathy are crucial in breaking the cycle, allowing societies to learn from their histories rather than repeat them. The lessons of the Black Death remain relevant, urging vigilance against the allure of easy answers. The Black Death pogroms remind us that mass hysteria does not require ignorance. It thrives on uncertainty. As we navigate our own turbulent times, we must remain aware of the power of fear to distort our perceptions. In understanding the past, we can strive for a future where compassion prevails over suspicion, ensuring that the darkest chapters of history do not repeat themselves.